Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to talk about a graded potential, picking up where we left off from membrane potentials, okay? So if you like today's video, if you enjoy it, if you learned something from it, consider liking, consider subscribing, and maybe even leaving a comment. Without further ado, let's get started. So, a graded potential, what is it, and how is it related to our discussion with neurons, and what do they do? So, just like last time, we'll write a small list and we'll always keep referring back to it. A graded potential is a local change in membrane potential. Okay? In membrane potential. Okay? Now, this local change in membrane potential can either be positive or negative. Meaning, if my resting membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts, I can either go a negative direction and make the membrane negative 90 millivolts, or I can go to a positive direction and make the membrane negative 60 millivolts, okay? That is going in a more positive direction, right? Because I took this number, all right, and I added positives to it to make it negative 60, okay? Okay, so what is the next thing? Well, the next thing is this graded potential, it travels a very, very short distance, okay? Travels a very short distance, and it is very decremental, meaning it doesn't last very long. And in fact, it travels only a few millimeters, okay? It also varies in magnitude. So again, we'll talk about this. It varies in its magnitude, okay? And duration, by the way. And duration. Its purpose, its job, is to either get us to or prevent an action potential, okay? Purpose is to either get us an action potential, right? Get us to an action potential, I should say. Action potential, or prevent us from getting one. Okay? Great. Where does it occur on a neuron? Where does the graded potential occur? Because remember, we said on any cell, the resting membrane potential is on the actual membrane, right? It's along the membrane. This is all membrane here, okay? So where does a graded potential specifically occur? Where does that local change in membrane potential occur? Well, it can occur on the dendrites, these are the dendrites, or the cell body, okay? So the dendrites or the cell body, okay? Occurs on dendrites or cell body. Great, that's where graded potential occurs. That's where it happens, all right? Now, how do you actually get a graded potential? How do you trigger a graded potential? There has to be some sort of stimulus, okay? And there are different types of stimuli depending on the kind of, neuron we're dealing with. You can have a graded potential triggered with a chemical stimulus. This is very common, okay? The chemical stimulus requires something called a neurotransmitter. That actually is the chemical, okay? So that's a neurotransmitter. That's what we'll be talking a lot about in these next series of videos. But do realize that they can also be triggered by something called a mechanical stimulus. Okay? Mechanical stimulus. For example, by touching a hand. Okay? So there are specific, let's say this is a skin cell, okay? And I touch my skin. Okay, how can I feel that I'm touching my skin? Well, there are specific kind of neurons that are attached to the end of my skin, and they have sensory receptors that whenever I touch, I mechanically deform the shape of that receptor, and that causes a local change in a membrane potential to occur, or a graded potential, which then turns into an action potential, which will then, tell this neuron that, hey, somebody's touching my skin, okay? That's a very oversimplified version of it, but that's what a mechanical stimulus is, okay? That's, for example, touching a hand, right? It's just mechanically deforming something. Now, what are the two types of a graded potential? Because we can have two types of graded potentials. Remember, we said that they can either be positive changes or negative changes in the membrane potential, right? Well, guess what? The ones that are positive changes are called EPSPs. We'll talk about what this actually is, okay? This is actually called an excitatory postsynaptic potential, okay? This right here is called an IPSP. So the IPSP makes you more negative, right? Makes the resting membrane potential more negative, whereas the EPSP makes the resting membrane potential more positive, okay? Alrighty, that's really important, okay? All of these are really, really important to remember. So there are two types of graded potentials, an EPSP or an IPSP. EPSPs make the resting membrane potential more positive, whereas an IPSP makes the resting membrane potential more negative, okay? So let's kind of become familiar with certain terminology. So let's say I have this graph here, right? Here is time in milliseconds, okay? Time in milliseconds. And I have voltage in millivolts, okay? And I have negative 70 millivolts here, which is my resting membrane potential. And I draw a line here, okay? Let's say that I'm currently at resting membrane potential, okay? But then something happens. Something happens, and my resting membrane potential kind of changes, okay? The voltage changes and it increases. It becomes more positive. It travels in a more positive direction. When I take the resting membrane potential, okay, and I make it more positive, okay, and in fact, when I'm going from a negative to a positive, I call that depolarization. Okay? So resting membrane potential or negative to positive is called depolarization. It's just a fancy word for saying I'm making the membrane more positive. Okay? Now, when the membrane is returning back to resting membrane potential, right? Because it always does. Remember, we said that there are leaky channels and sodium, potassium, ATPases that always kind of bring us back to resting membrane potential. That's where the cell wants to be. That is also given a name. That's called repolarization. Okay? Repolarization. And, you know, I'm not going to get into nitty gritty of it, but 0 millivolts, okay? Remember, we start at 0 millivolts. That is depolarized. Polarization just means that there is no charge, okay? Polarization means that there is a charge. So depolarizing, bringing the membrane from negative 70 all the way up to kind of a positive number, as you know, hopefully 0, that would be depolarizing. Okay? Repolarizing would mean I'm restoring some polarization. Okay? This negative charge, I'm restoring it to the actual membrane. All right? So, one more time, going from resting membrane potential to positive is called depolarization. Going from a positive value, right, positive voltage, towards the resting membrane potential is called repolarization. That's really important. That is the definition of it. But then let's say, you know, I'm back here again, all right? But now, for some reason, I actually become super, super negative, okay? Super, super negative. This right here, this is called hyperpolarization. Okay, hypopolarized because, well, I'm even more negative. Let's say I get down to negative 90 for some reason, negative 90 millivolts. I'm hyperpolarized. I'm more negative than I started. Okay, so going from a negative to even more negative, that's called hyperpolarization. All right? Now, why am I actually telling you this? Because whenever I launch an EPSP, what am I doing? I am having a local change in the membrane potential that is positive. So I am depolarizing, okay? And since that thing, this graded potential is decremental, once it fades away, right, the membrane repolarizes, all right? From that positive up here back down to this. Hyperpolarization is caused by an IPSP. An IPSP was a local change in the membrane potential that was negative. So if I make the membrane more negative, that's a IPSP, right? And then of course it comes back to RMP, resting membrane potential. Note that when I'm coming back up here to resting membrane potential, that is not called a repolarization, okay? There is no name for that. This whole thing is hyperpolarization. Repolarization is strictly defined as going from a positive state, right, a depolarized state, to the resting membrane potential, right? I really want to specify that. Okay, so let's get rid of all this extra kind of stuff here. Oops, let me get rid of this. Okay, this is the terminology that I wanted you to be familiar with. Okay, now let's take an overview of what a graded potential can look like if it was an EPSP and an IPSP, and then we'll expand on it a little bit more on the next page. Okay? So first things first, let's kind of zoom in on where this would actually be happening. We said it occurs on the dendrite of the cell body. For the purposes of this, let's just kind of zoom in on the cell body, okay? So outside would be the extracellular fluid. This would be the intracellular fluid, right? And of course, just like the last video, this is our membrane, right, all around. Okay. In order for a neurotransmitter, in order for a graded potential to occur, we have to have a trigger, a stimulus. We said that we're not going to talk about a mechanical stimulus, so don't really worry about this. We're going to talk about chemical stimulus, okay? Now, the chemical stimulus in question is a neurotransmitter. So there are these things, these channels, if you will, called ligand-gated channels. So ligand-gated channels, okay? And this ligand-gated channel, right, you guys know that the ligand is what? Something that binds to a receptor. Well, what is that something? That is our chemical stimulus, our neurotransmitter, okay? I'm going to depict it with this black kind of dot here. It will come and bind to this ligand-gated channel, okay? This green ligand-gated channel. This is our neurotransmitter. Once it binds, notice this channel has a gate, right? It will open that gate. It'll open that gate, okay? It'll open that gate, and what would happen? What would happen then? I'll tell you what would happen. A bunch of things might happen, okay? Let's say, just for the sake of color coding, right, that we're going to try and cause an EPSP. So we're going to try and depolarize, increase the membrane potential. How would I do that? Well, I'd have to add positive charges into the cell. Okay, what is a positive charge that I know that likes to come into the cell down its concentration gradient passively? Sodium. So I open this gate, right? Sodium will start to flood inside of the cell, okay, and make the cell very, 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 very positive very quickly, okay? But it's only this portion, okay? It's only this portion. So what I mean by this? Well, this is the whole neuron, right? But that exact stimulus occurred right here, right at that point, okay? It's not happening here or here or here. It happened right here where the neurotransmitter bound to its ligand-gated channel, okay? So positive charges are coming in here, okay? And let's say we depolarized, right? Because we were depolarized. But guess what? This depolarization is not enough to get us to an action potential. Why do I say that? Because remember, the entire purpose of a graded potential is to either get us to an action potential or prevent us from getting one. Well, how would I get to an action potential? I have to use an EPSP. How would I prevent us from getting an action potential? I would use an IPSP. Why might I say such a thing? In order to reach an action potential, right? Let's say here's my resting membrane potential at -70. I have to reach something called a threshold potential. Okay, and we talked about this at like the introduction to neurology video. The threshold potential is typically 15 millivolts above the resting membrane potential, so it's -55 millivolts. As soon as I hit this voltage, I would launch an action potential. Okay? If I don't hit this voltage, right? So if I'm depolarizing, but then I don't hit it, I don't hit that voltage, no action potential occurs. But if I depolarize, and I hit that voltage, then I launch an action potential. Okay? All right. So we have to remember the threshold potential. So let's say this guy comes in and he depolarizes this location, this portion of the dendrite, all the way from negative 70 millivolts to negative 60 millivolts, okay? Does this look like threshold potential to you? Doesn't look like it to me. Threshold potential is negative 55. So if we didn't hit that threshold potential, no action potential occurs. And you know what? We said that this guy is decremental. So guess what's going to happen? All those sodium charges, those sodium ions that you brought in, guess what's going to happen? They are going to come here. They're going to go straight through this guy, right? Which loves to take 3 sodium ions and push them out and brings 2 potassium in. This guy was our sodium potassium pump. Okay? Sodium potassium pump. 20% contribution to resting membrane potential. Remember that? Great. Great. And, I just kind of have these as the fact that sodium usually loves to come in, right, for the resting membrane potential stuff. And we know that potassium usually loves to go out. Again, this is just all like review of the membrane potential stuff. Okay? This is review. But if the ligand-gated channel binds its neurotransmitter and it opens, and we are trying to cause an EPSP, that means that this ligand-gated channel is specific to sodium, and it'll bring sodium in, okay, and it'll cause a depolarization to occur, which means we're making the, cell positive. And remember that we can make the cell positive by 2 ways, by either adding positive charges or removing negative charges, and we'll talk about that later in the video. Okay? Now, in this case, we didn't hit the threshold potential to cause an action potential, so this EPSP, this graded potential, it will eventually kind of die out because it's decremental, okay? And then move out, okay? Now let's take a look at an IPSP scenario. Well, if we need an IPSP to occur, then first of all, a neurotransmitter would have to bind, okay? Alrighty. And then the gate of this channel would open. This is a ligand-gated channel, okay? Channel, again, the ligand being the neurotransmitter, the gate being this gate, and this channel being a channel, okay? All right. And now that we want to hyperpolarize, what would you think we want to do? Because remember, an IPSP does what? It hyperpolarizes. It makes the membrane more negative to prevent us from getting an action potential, whereas an EPSP depolarizes to get us to a threshold potential, okay, so that we can reach an action potential. So this IPSP that we're trying to cause, we require 2 things to happen. Right? Well, we don't require 2 things to happen. I should rephrase that. In order for an IPSP to happen, we have to make the cell negative. How do we make the cell negative? 2 ways. We can either bring in negative charges to make the cell more negative, such as chloride, or we can bring positive charges outside of the cell. Well, how do you bring positive charges outside of the cell? What's a positive charge that naturally, passively likes to move down its concentration gradient? Potassium. So the easier method and the more common method of causing a graded potential such as an IPSP would be to just take potassium, right, and push it out throughout this channel. And you could see a lot of potassium would leave here, right, making the cells super negative, okay, bringing the cell from negative 70 millivolts, for example, to negative 90 millivolts, okay? Great. And, this right here was called hyperpolarization. Now, eventually, what would happen? Eventually, we would get back to our resting membrane potential. How? Well, we would do this because imagine these potassiums that just left, what are they going to do? They're going to come right here and they'll come right back into the cell to potassium using the sodium potassium ATPase. All right. And we know that there's obviously going to be 3 sodium pushed out here. Okay. So this is how we're kind of restoring the concentration gradient and the resting membrane potential. Okay. Great. So that's just how EPSPs and IPSPs work. All right? That's just how they work. Now, let's talk briefly about what can actually influence a graded potential, okay? So we know that it's triggered by a chemical or mechanical stimulus, and we were talking about the chemical stimulus being a neurotransmitter, okay? Which, by the way, is just a group name for a class of molecules, okay? We could have many neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glutamine, so many things. But they're just a class of molecules that we just give them a generic name called neurotransmitters because they are released from a neuron and they're trying to transmit a signal from one neuron to the next. We talked about this in the first video in the series. Now, what is a graded potential actually influenced by? Well, it's influenced by 2 things, okay? 2 things. And the first one is the strength of the stimulus. So since in our case we were talking about the neurotransmitter being the stimulus, if the strength of the stimulus is very, very high, then guess what? That will affect my graded potential a lot. And bear with me here. I'm going to write this down and I'll explain what I mean. The other thing is the duration of the stimuli. Okay? Duration of the stimuli, which will also affect the graded potential. So, since we're talking about neurotransmitters, our chemical stimuli, let's imagine a cell. Okay, let's imagine a cell, and it has one, a ligand-gated channel, right, and 2 ligand-gated channel and 3 ligand-gated channels. Okay. If only one neurotransmitter binds to this ligand-gated channel, right? We have 3 ligand-gated channels, but only one neurotransmitter bound, then the strength of our stimulus is pretty low, which means I would bring in, for example, less sodium than I would have if I bound all 3 of these. Okay, if I bound all 3 of these, a lot more sodium would come in. That's an example of the strength of the stimulus. For example, if I want to cause an EPSP, right? If I bind only one of these neurotransmitters, then I have very weak strength of stimulus. If I bind all 3 of them, then I'm going to bring in more positive charges, greater depolarization, and maybe I have a chance of hitting the threshold potential then, right? So that's how the strength of stimulus example works. The other one is the duration of the stimulus. What if this neurotransmitter, instead of staying here for 5 seconds, and this is just an example, 5 seconds, it stayed there for 20 seconds. The presence of this neurotransmitter, okay, determines whether this gate here remains open or not. So if the neurotransmitter leaves, the gate closes, and the flow of ions in or out stops, okay? However, if this neurotransmitter stays, then our stimulus is present for a longer period of time as well, okay? And that can also affect my graded potential. If my stimulus is present for a long period of time, then my graded potential is also present for a long period of time. If the strength of my stimulus is very high, then my graded potential's magnitude is very high. Remember how we were talking about this in the start? We said that it varies in magnitude and duration. And that's completely dependent on the stimulus. If the stimulus is very strong, then the magnitude of my graded potential is strong. If my stimulus is there for a long period of time, then my graded potential is also present for a long period of time, okay? That's how these guys can vary. Okay, so let's kind of put arrows here so we can understand. If the strength of stimulus is high, then my graded potential magnitude is high. If my duration of the stimuli is low, then guess what? If my duration of stimuli is high, then my graded potential is also there for a long period of time. However, if the strength of my stimulus is low, then guess what? My graded potential will have a smaller magnitude. If the duration of my stimulus is low, meaning that my neurotransmitter stays there, bound to that receptor, right, that channel, ligand-gated channel, very, very, transiently for a short period of time, then the graded potential will also last for a small amount of time. Okay? How can I represent this graphically? Well, let's say I have a graph here, membrane potential in millivolts on the y-axis and time in milliseconds. Okay? I have graded potential, graded potential, graded potential, graded potential. Okay? But and by the way, these are all clearly EPSPs because they are increasing the membrane potential. But that's not the point right now. The point here is I'm trying to demonstrate to you exactly what I talked about here graphically. So let's say this plus sign denotes the strength of my stimulus. And this arrow right here represents the duration of my stimulus. So how long my neurotransmitter is bound to the ligand-gated channel. And this one is how many neurotransmitters are bound to the ligand-gated channels that I have present on my cell membrane. If I have one plus sign indicating the strength of my stimulus, right, then I will get this much change. Okay, great. Let's say I keep the duration the same as this original case, but I only increase the strength of my stimulus. Then I would, of course, notice that my graded potential has a little bit of a bigger magnitude, okay, as compared to this one, right? So you can clearly see this one has a bigger magnitude. But the time period that they were there for remains the same because I didn't change the duration of the stimulus. Again, let's say I keep the duration of the stimulus the same, but I add another plus sign for my strength of stimulus. And you can obviously, again, see the magnitude goes even higher, but the duration doesn't change, okay? Now let's say I keep the same strength of stimuli as the previous scenario, but I increase the duration of the stimuli. I increase how long my neurotransmitter is actually there. Now what do you notice? I will hit the exact same magnitude, but the duration that my graded potential is there for is much longer, okay? And I'll tell you this, if the duration that my graded potential is longer and its magnitude is larger, right? Then the chances of me getting to threshold is much higher in this scenario, right? Because this scenario represents an EPSP. If it was the reverse scenario, right, where everything was kind of going down, right, and then like this, then the chances of me staying away from an action potential is also much higher because I'm much further away from threshold potential, right? It's the exact same concept both ways, but it's easier to understand it, I think, using the EPSP example because people don't like negative numbers too much. Okay, so again, we literally just depicted everything we talked about here graphically, okay? Basically saying that if the strength of my stimulus is high, my graded potential magnitude will be high. So we can see that right here. 1 plus, okay, this much. 2 plus, a little bit higher. 3 plus signs, whoa, very big magnitude. But if the duration of my stimulus increases, then my graded potential is there for longer. So I keep the same stimulus, but I increase the amount of time that it's there for. And now you can see that it's clearly there for a much longer period of time, my graded potential. Easy peasy. Alrighty. Now let's move on to another thing. Okay? Because now we've talked about all these, right? There's a local change in membrane potential, short distance, decremental, right? Because look, short distance, right? All these positive charges, they'll travel a little bit and then they'll be decremental because they'll get removed, right? We talked about how it varies in magnitude and the duration because it depends on the strength of the stimulus and the duration of the stimulus. Okay? We said that it occurs on the dendrite and cell body. We said that its purpose is to either get us to an action potential or prevent an action potential, right? We talked about all that. But now let's get a little bit more specific. And let's take a look at how EPSPs and IPSPs are actually kind of happening, right? Okay, so let's take a look at this. First things first. Remember those ligand-gated channels I was talking about? Right? So over here I said this is a ligand-gated channel and this is a ligand-gated channel. Well, I was kind of simplifying things for you there a little bit. okay? Because technically speaking, there are different kinds of ligand-gated channels, okay? And let's do this in a different color. Let's say this like this. You can have a ligand-gated channel that's called ionotropic, okay? And you can have a ligand-gated channel that is actually metabotropic, okay? Metabotropic. We usually said that the metabotropic is indirect, it has an indirect effect on the membrane potential, okay? And this one is a direct effect. And don't you worry, I will explain what I mean by this. I will explain exactly what I mean by this. But the key point I really want to get across to you is that both of these are ligand-gated channels, or just different types of ligand-gated channels. You can have an ionotropic channel or a metabotropic channel. And both of these guys are capable of causing an EPSP and IPSP, depending on the ligand, the neurotransmitter that they bind. Okay? Great. Now, another thing. You know a neuron, right? Here's a neuron. This neuron here, right, is currently in a synapse with two different neurons. And if you remember from the first video, we said that this would be a presynaptic neuron, this would be a presynaptic neuron, and this would be a postsynaptic neuron, right? This neuron here, right, it is being acted on by two different neurons. And for the purposes of learning, let's say that this neuron, this red neuron, is an inhibitory neuron, meaning it will try to lower the resting membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron. This one is a stimulatory neuron, which means it will try to increase the resting membrane potential of this postsynaptic neuron. Why would it do this? Because it wants to make an action potential occur here by getting us to threshold potential, which is at negative 55 millivolts. This guy wants to prevent an action potential from occurring. So what will he do? He will try and hyperpolarize us, get us further away from the threshold potential. So this guy, in other words, will cause an IPSP, whereas this guy, in other words, will cause an EPSP. Okay? Remember, both EPSPs and IPSPs, right, can be happening on one neuron. All right. In fact, there are multiple inputs, right? This is an input on this neuron. There are multiple inputs occurring on one neuron, like a lot of times. Like there are hundreds, thousands, maybe even billion, I don't know, of inputs on a singular postsynaptic neuron. So really, the combination of the EPSPs and IPSPs, right? If I add all of those together, the number that I'll get, that will determine whether or not this guy reaches threshold potential and causes an action potential, or it doesn't reach threshold potential and doesn't get an action potential, okay? The combination of the EPSPs and IPSPs being acted on one postsynaptic neuron is called the grand postsynaptic potential, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add all the EPSPs and IPSPs that are kind of being acted on this postsynaptic membrane, and I will finally come to an answer called the grand postsynaptic potential, which tells me whether or not this guy will actually hit threshold and cause an action potential or not. Okay, now let's zoom in. Let's zoom in here at this site, okay, and figure out how is this kind of neuron causing an IPSP or EPSP, okay? Because we looked at the process over here. We said that this was a EPSP, this was an IPSP, right? And we said that this is kind of how it's decremental and all that, whatever. But now I want to show you that this can actually occur using these two different channels, the ionotropic and the metabotropic, okay? So first things first, let's do the negative one, the inhibitory presynaptic neuron. Well, he's releasing these red neurotransmitters, so let's draw that. Here's a red neurotransmitter. And again, since it's an inhibitory neuron, it's currently in an inhibitory synapse, which means it's gonna try its best to what? To inhibit, to cause an IPSP. How will it do that? Well, it can act on this channel right here, which is ionotropic, okay? And if that neurotransmitter binds, guess what happens? This channel, this ionotropic channel, is the same one that we were talking about in the last slide. It has a gate, As soon as the neurotransmitter binds, that gate opens, and since it's an IPSP, what's going to happen? Positive charges, such as potassium, will leak, or not leak, they will leave the cell to make the inside more and more negative, okay? Now, another scenario that could happen is if I would grab a negative charge, such as chloride, and push it inside of the cell. Either way, I'm causing what to happen? I'm causing an IPSP to occur. Let's change the color here to red. I'm causing an IPSP to occur because boom, 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 boom. Negative charges are accumulating. Okay? Great. Okay. So that's if I use an inotropic channel. Now, how do I remember the difference? Like which one's ionotropic, which one's metabotropic? I like to remember ionotropic because it lets ions directly through itself. It literally has a pocket, a receptor almost, that binds the neurotransmitter, and it has its own channel attached to itself. So it lets ions pass directly through itself. That's how I remember it's an ionotropic channel. What about a metabotropic channel? This is what a metabotropic channel looks like, okay? We said that this metabotropic channel is G protein coupled. Take a look at it. This is exactly what it looks like. This is where the ligand binds. So our inhibitory neurotransmitter will bind here, right? Just like it bound in this scenario. So it will bind here, but the only difference here is that this guy, right, this metabotropic receptor, which is, by the way, again, a type of ligand-gated channel, it, on the intracellular side, is bound to something called a G protein, okay? And, we'll talk more about these in our endocrinology playlist, but the G protein, what it does is it kind of separates from this metabotropic receptor as soon as the ligand binds to it. Right? So as soon as a neurotransmitter binds to this metabotropic receptor, the G protein separates and it can go over to a specific channel on the membrane and stimulate its opening. And that will cause either, like I said, the movement of positive charges outside or the movement of negative charges inside, achieving the same result, IPSP. Okay? So you see how we can achieve the exact same thing in an inhibitory synapse by using two different pathways. We can go through an inotropic way or the metabotropic way. And that really just depends on which receptor is present on the surface of this postsynaptic membrane. Okay? Now, you understand now that why we call the ionotropic direct, because it directly lets ions in and out of itself, whereas the metabotropic is indirect. This G protein, right, will activate a bunch of things called secondary messengers inside of the cell, and those secondary messengers will then go and transmit the message this guy delivered to us, and it will tell some channel on the membrane, hey, listen, you got to open up and let positive charges out so we can cause an IPSP. Or, hey, you got to open up and let negative charges in because we want to cause an IPSP. Okay? So that's what the metabotropic is indirect. That's why. But you can clearly see that they can both cause an IPSP. Now let's look at the same scenario, but with the stimulatory synapse, okay? Or excitatory synapse. Remember, this guy was going to try and cause an EPSP. So he had these green neurotransmitters. So let's change the green. Green neurotransmitter binds. Of course, this guy is gated. So his gate opens up. Let's show it like this. His gate opens up. And what's going to happen? Well, we're going to try and cause an EPSP. So that means positive charges can come into the cell or negative charges can leave. Okay? Great. Great, great. Now, that's the ionotropic path. Either way, let's depict it like this. Either way, I'm increasing the positive charges and causing an EPSP. What about in the metabotropic scenario? Well, again, the neurotransmitter, our ligand, will bind. The G protein will become activated. It will separate, and it'll go and activate secondary messengers that will stimulate the opening of some channel on the membrane. Okay? And that right there, you know what it's going to do? it will make, and let's do it in the same color, it will make positive charges come into the cell, or it will make negative charges leave the cell, okay? Our positive charge could be sodium, for example. And I'll give you an example. Chloride here could leave the cell. And you might be asking me, hey, Keon, in the previous video, you said chloride movement doesn't really occur because its equilibrium potential is the same as the resting membrane potential. And I'd say you're absolutely correct, but there are certain times where it can occur, and we'll talk about it at the end of this video, okay? But this is how IPSPs and EPSPs can occur using these two different pathways, right? Ionotropic or metabotropic. And again, depending on which receptor is present on the surface of the postsynaptic membrane, usually it's ionotropic, by the way. Depending on that, we can then kind of figure out that, okay, we're going to take this route rather than this route. But the whole thing I'm trying to prove to you is that they can both cause an EPSP or an IPSP. And I said that the combination of the EPSPs and the IPSPs being acted on in the postsynaptic neuron is called the grand postsynaptic potential. Okay? Great. Yeah, and remember, all of these like charges, they can vary, man. They can vary in their kind of magnitude. For example, an EPSP can be as little as 0.5 millivolts. Okay, it can change the membrane by as little as 0.5 millivolts, which will literally do nothing for us. Okay, for example, if we're negative 70 millivolts, we know that our threshold is negative 55, right? Because I said it's usually 15 above. So a 0.5 millivolt difference from negative 70 won't really do anything. Like, it just means nothing to me. All right, which brings me to my next point, which is one GP won't guarantee an AP. So one graded potential won't guarantee an action potential. So what do we do? In this scenario, we're talking about the specific kind of graded potential that might get us to an action potential. And if you remember from the previous slide, we said that's called an EPSP, okay? Because it's making the membrane positive, depolarizing, getting us close to threshold. Remember, if I hit threshold, I'm causing an action potential. We'll talk more about that in the next video. But one graded potential doesn't guarantee an action potential, right? Because we said they can vary in magnitude, and we said that it can be as small as like 0.5 millivolts, and like that's like no good to me. So if I want to cause a graded potential, what do I have to do? I have to do something called synaptic integration. Basically, I will take every single input that is occurring on the actual postsynaptic membrane, and I will integrate them together, okay? And that will lead me to these two kind of things. I can have something called a temporal summation and another thing called spatial summation. Okay, now bear with me here. What is temporal summation and what is spatial summation? Okay, temporal summation is, imagine this. Imagine I have a neuron right here, right? And, you know, here's its cell body, axon, and synaptic terminal. And let's draw it in black here. We have another neuron here. Whoop, whoop, and there we go. So I have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron, right? Let's say I have one postsynaptic neuron, right, launch an action potential, a singular action potential. What would that look like on a graph? Well, the graph is recording the voltage change in the postsynaptic membrane, right? Because that's the one that's going to be changing its membrane in response to the presynaptic neuron firing, okay? So what would that look like? If the presynaptic neuron fires once, it fires one action potential, right? One action potential, and that's going to cause the release of neurotransmitters, which will then bind to their respective ligand-gated channels on the surface of this postsynaptic membrane. You know what's going to happen? It will cause an increase in our membrane potential, right, from negative 70, but then it'll go back down, okay? The strength of the stimulus was not enough to take us to threshold potential. It was a sub-threshold stimulus. Okay, let's say this guy, instead of launching 1 action potential, he started launching 2, 3, 4 action potentials continuously. Okay, so he launches 1, and instead of stopping there and waiting, he did 1, okay, done, 2, okay, done, 3, done, 4, done. Then it would kind of look something like this. Memory potential would rise. It would start to go back down until the second action potential hits. And then it goes up again, and it goes back down again until the third action potential hits. Okay, and then it starts to go back down again, and then the fourth action potential hits. Okay, you see this? You see what's happening here? We are summing up, okay, all of the graded potentials caused together. All right, we are integrating all of those positive charges that are brought about by the binding of the neurotransmitters to their respective ligand-gated channels on the postsynaptic membrane. We're integrating all those positive charges coming in from those EPSPs together, and that's called temporal summation. So one more time. Temporal summation is when one presynaptic neuron is continuously firing an action potential, like continuously firing action potentials on a single postsynaptic neuron to try and get at the threshold. In reality, this could happen, but it's very, very uncommon. We have another kind of summation called spatial summation. And for the sake of time, I'm going to just draw the diagram for you, and then we'll continue. Okay, so spatial summation refers to when multiple presynaptic neurons, such as this, are each going to fire one action potential only. Okay, this is really important. Multiple presynaptic neurons each fire one action potential. So one AP here, one AP here, one AP here, and they release X number of neurotransmitters in the synapse, okay? And they will all go and bind to the postsynaptic membrane ligand-gated channels, and they will cause some sort of EPSP response here that we can record on this actual graph. And it would look something like this, because all three of them are going to fire one action potential, right? So one here, one here, one here. They're each going to release a certain amount of neurotransmitters, and that would record something like this. Boom, boom, boom. Before we come back down again. Okay? Notice how this is much faster than this. Why is that? Why is that? It's because the strength of our stimulus is higher. This guy launches one action potential. He only releases, X number of neurotransmitters, and he will keep doing action potentials and keep, releasing more and more. But imagine this. Imagine all three of these guys, just one action potential. They launch X number, but there's three of them. Okay. Now, we don't know what that number is, but I can sure as hell tell you that it'll be more neurotransmitters here than there will be here, because these guys are 3 against 1, okay? And so this neuron here would definitely reach threshold potential before this neuron does, okay? So if they launch one action potential again, each, all right, maybe it'll be strong enough to get us to threshold, okay? Those are the two types of summation that can occur, right? So remember, the whole point of this is just demonstrate to you that one graded potential will never be enough to get us an action potential. We have to sum them on top of one another, okay? Add them on top of one another. So we can either do them with temporal summation or spatial summation. Now, in reality, in real life, we don't actually do either of these commonly. We do something called spatiotemporal summation, okay? Which is a combination of this. So in that scenario, I would have a neuron such as this, okay? And I would have boom, 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 and again, boom, 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 okay? So I would have multiple presynaptic neurons firing multiple times on a postsynaptic neuron. Because remember, spatial summation is multiple presynaptic neurons firing only once. on a postsynaptic neuron, whereas temporal summation is a single presynaptic neuron firing multiple times. So if I add these two concepts together, this guy firing multiple times and this being multiple of these presynaptic neurons, I will get spatial temporal summation. Okay, summation, which was what? Which was multiple presynaptic neurons firing multiple times, all right, on one postsynaptic neuron, meaning they're going to release a whole bunch more neurotransmitters on the surface membrane of this guy, of this postsynaptic cell membrane. And the integrated sum of all of that will determine whether I hit threshold potential, okay? So if all of these guys are releasing EPSPs, then my God, we will hit, not releasing EPSPs. If they all release stimulatory neurotransmitters, then we will hit threshold potential much faster because we will sum all of those EPSPs to one another, okay? Extremely fast. If, for example, this guy's releasing like a inhibitory neurotransmitter, but these two are releasing stimulatory, then, we will have something like this. We will go, okay, up, 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 little dip downwards, and then up, 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 okay? And again, the sum of all of the EPSPs and IPSPs is called GPSP, grand postsynaptic potential. Okay, so that's going to finish it with all of this. Last thing, and I promise we're done here. Last thing I want to talk about is chloride. Because remember I said sometimes we might, in special cells, we might bring in negative charges inside of the cell to cause an IPSP, or sometimes we might actually bring negative charges from inside of the cell out. The only negative charge that we kind of know of and is actually relevant to us will be chloride. And if you remember, chloride concentration outside of the cell was 100 millimoles per liter, whereas inside of the cell it was 7 millimoles per liter. So in this scenario, we're going to look at chloride movement in neurons and its relation to IPSPs and EPSPs, because this video is all about graded potentials. So first things first, I know that we always say that resting membrane potential is negative 70, right? But really, that's kind of an average, okay? And it's an average among cells that are not excitable, meaning they can't change their membrane potential, such as neurons or muscle cells. Certain neurons, however, have different membrane potentials. So for example, let's say that you have 3 different neurons here. 1 neuron, 2 neuron, 3 neuron, okay? This neuron has a membrane potential of negative 60 millivolts. This neuron has a resting membrane potential of negative 90 millivolts, right? These are all resting, okay? And this one's negative 70, our regular old neuron. They all have the same concentration of chloride inside and the same concentration of chloride outside. But we're going to see how they can utilize their resting membrane potential and specific transporters that they have to cause an IPSP or EPSP, okay? So sometimes there are these leaky channels, right? There are these, and let me change color here. There are these leaky chloride channels, okay, which kind of function exactly like our leaky sodium or leaky potassium channels. But if you remember, I said that there will be no net movement of chloride in or out of these, even if there is a concentration gradient. If our resting membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts, there will be no net movement. Why? Because the equilibrium potential of chloride is also negative 70. But in this scenario, that's not the case. In this scenario, the resting membrane potential is negative 60 millivolts, okay? And if it's negative 60 millivolts, then this chloride, this leaky chloride channel, will definitely follow its concentration gradient in, okay? And, it'll make the cell a tiny bit negative. Now, this wouldn't count as an IPSP technically, because these leaky channels, right, in cells that have a resting membrane potential of, for example, negative 60, right, they try to, or they aim to stabilize the resting membrane potential. So for example, you know how we have sodium channels that are kind of like, leaky, right? And what would happen is sodium would actually come in and would make the membrane a bit positive. So negative 60 would maybe reach negative 56. Well, these chloride channels exist to kind of bring the membrane back down to -60, kind of stabilizing the membrane potential as where it is, where it's at. Okay? And essentially, they kind of counterbalance the leak of any other ions. That's the role of chloride in certain cells. Now, that doesn't really relate to IPSPs and EPSPs, but it was still important to say that nonetheless. How does it relate to an IPSP? Well, there are chloride ligand-gated channels, and when a neurotransmitter binds, it opens up this chloride ligand-gated channel. You know what's going to happen? Chloride will flow from in to out, following its concentration gradient from high to low. And why can it do that? Because its electrical gradient is also in this direction. So it will passively flow down, and it will make the cell super negative, like very, very negative, causing a what? An IPSP. Great. In another cell that has, for example, a resting membrane potential of -90 millivolts, right? Let's say I want to cause an IPSP again. Yeah, let's say I'm trying to cause another IPSP. But in this cell, right, they don't have this channel. They don't have this channel. So what would you do here? Okay? They don't have this channel, one. And two, the membrane potential is -90 millivolts. Whereas we know the equilibrium potential of chloride is -70. Okay? So if I want to cause an IPSP, I have to bring chloride in, but this is the problem. This is the problem, right? Chloride needs to come in, right? But it needs to use active transport, okay? Whether it's primary or secondary, it doesn't really matter, but it uses active transport. Why does it need to use active transport? Because currently, the chloride is moving with its concentration gradient, right? So 100 to 7, right? Great. It's moving with its concentration gradient, but it's actually moving against its electrical gradient, okay? -90, -70, okay? Remember, chloride reaches equilibrium at -70, meaning it doesn't want to move, there would be no net movement anymore, right? But we want to force an IPSP to occur, so we have to use active transport to forcefully bring this chloride in, okay? More chloride in. Because the electrical gradient is kind of stopping us. So we have to use energy. So we have to use active transport, okay? And that may require ATP, or it may be secondary active transport. Now, similar scenario, but we want to cause an EPSP. So if we want to cause an EPSP, I would have to forcefully move chloride outside of the cell, right? Negative charge out. Well, if that's the case, I have to move the chloride against its concentration gradient. Because look, it's 7 inside, but 100 outside. So I have to move it against its concentration gradient from low to high. What does that require? That requires energy, okay? So again, we have to use active transport. Transport here. Again, it might require ATP, all right? Or it might be secondary active transport. Either way, EPSP will be caused because I will cause the movement of chlorides out. So the end goal here, we can cause an IPSP and an EPSP with chloride depending on what the situation is. If the neuron has a membrane potential that is lower than the equilibrium potential of chloride, then it requires a active transporter channel that can bring chloride in with its concentration gradient but move it against its electrical gradient. If I want to cause an EPSP, then I need a neuron that can have a active transporter that pushes chloride against its concentration gradient, all right, outside of the cell. And another way we said you can have an IPSP is if you have this kind of ligand-gated channel, which in response to some neurotransmitter opens its gate and allows chloride to kind of go down its concentration gradient and electrical gradient here, because remember, it's -70 millivolts for the equilibrium concentration, which means chloride will move into the cell until it makes the cell -70, okay? So that's an IPSP, okay, guys? So that's how we cause 2 IPSPs here and an EPSP, all right? And by the way, A great kind of example of this would, for example, be the GABA A ligand gated channel. Okay, GABA is a neurotransmitter. Okay, called gamma aminobutyric acid, and imagine this neurotransmitter is GABA, and this channel is called GABA A. It does this exact same thing. It brings chloride in down its kind of concentration gradient. Okay, and its electrical gradient. Okay, guys, we covered a lot of concepts today regarding graded potentials, right? But this will prepare you very nicely for our discussion on the next video on action potentials, okay? So if you enjoyed the video, if you liked it, if you learned something from it, please hit the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.